The seventh one came in at 3:11 in the morning, and Priya Anand knew before she touched him that he was going to live, because they always lived. That was the thing she would think about later, in the quiet that came after everything, when she finally let herself assemble the pattern she had been too tired to see. They always lived. The city that fed her operating room a steady diet of the dead and the nearly dead. The overdoses, the wrong place teenagers, the domestic disputes that ended in kitchen knives. That city had for 6 weeks been sending her a different kind of patient. Men who bled beautifully. Men whose wounds were catastrophic and clean, as if someone had chosen exactly where to hurt them, and exactly how much time to leave on the clock. But that was later. On this night, she was only aware of the neon bleeding red and blue through the ambulance bay doors, the rubber squeal of the gurney, the paramedic shouting numbers she was already 3 steps ahead of. Male 30s, single, GSW to the upper right quadrant. BP's tanking. He's been down maybe 8 minutes. He hasn't been down 8 minutes, Priya said, snapping on gloves. And she was right, because the blood was still bright. She pressed 2 fingers into the wound and felt the man's whole body arch toward her, like a plant toward a window. His eyes came open, dark, wet, terrified. And then when they found her face strangely calm, as if he recognized her, as if he'd been told what she would look like. "You're going to be fine," she lied, and moved him. She did not notice the tattoo at first. She was elbow deep in his abdomen, chasing a bleeder that kept ducking behind the liver like it had a personality. And it was only when she reached across his chest for the retractor that she saw it. A small black bird, inked over his heart, wings folded, beak down. A crow, maybe. A raven. She had seen it before. 3 weeks ago, on a man with a shattered femur. 2 weeks ago, on a boy who couldn't have been 20, with a bullet lodged half an inch from his spine. Same bird, same place. Right over the heart where a surgeon's eyes would find it. Priya's hands did not stop moving. Her hands never stopped moving. That was what made her good, the total divorce between whatever her mind was doing and whatever her fingers were doing. Her mind said, "That's the same tattoo," and her fingers tied off the bleeder, and her mind said, "That's the third one," and her fingers checked the pressure, and her mind said, very quietly, the way you'd hear a door close 2 rooms away, "Someone is doing this on purpose." Then the man crashed and there was no more room for thinking. She brought him back. Of course she brought him back. 40 minutes later, she stood at the scrub sink with water running pink off her forearms. And through the window, she watched 2 men she had never seen before walk into her recovery ward like they owned the mortgage on it. They wore suits that cost more than she made in a month. They did not check in at the desk. The night charge nurse, a woman named Rosa, who had faced down drunk cops and grieving fathers without blinking, looked at these 2 men and then looked very deliberately at her computer screen and did not look up again. Priya dried her hands. She told herself it was the city. She told herself Miami was full of men in good suits and bad intentions, and that none of it was her business, that her business ended at the edge of the operating table and did not extend 1 inch into whatever war was being fought in the streets that kept feeding her its wounded. She told herself she was too tired to care, and that was true, and it was also the most dangerous thing she had ever told herself. She did not know that in a black car across the street, behind glass so dark it swallowed the neon whole, a man had watched her through the bay doors on a phone screen for 6 weeks. She did not know that he had memorized the way she pushed her hair off her forehead with the back of her wrist, because her hands were always occupied. She did not know that when the 7th man's heart stopped and started again under her palms, the man in the car had exhaled, for the first time in a long time, and said to no one in a voice like a door closing, "Her. It has to be her." His name, the name almost no one was permitted to say, was Dmitri Voss. The people who feared him, which was everyone, called him the Ghost because he had survived 3 things that should have killed a man, and because he moved through the city without seeming to occupy it, and because his enemies had a way of simply ceasing to exist quietly, as if they had never been real to begin with. What no one knew, not his enemies, not his soldiers, not the man who had spent 18 months planning his death, was that the Ghost was becoming one. There was a fragment of steel in his chest, the size of a grain of rice. He had carried it for 2 years, since the night in Odessa that had made him what he was, and for 2 years it had done nothing but ache in the cold. But metal in a body is a patient traveler. It had begun to move. A scan he had paid a great deal of money to keep off every record in the state showed it pressed now against the wall of his heart, and it was still moving, a fraction of a millimeter at a time, toward the one place a man cannot bleed and live. 3 surgeons had looked at those scans. The first had refused before the images finished loading. The second had named a number, a probability that Dmitri had found insulting to his intelligence. The third, the best cardiothoracic man in Florida, flown in at a cost that would have bought the hospital a new wing, had studied the scans for a long time, and then set them down and said gently, the way you speak to the doomed, that the fragment was in a place where a tremor, a hesitation, a single half-second of doubt would kill him on the table. You need hands that don't shake, the man had said. Not under pressure, not with your chest open and the clock running. I've been doing this 30 years and mine still shake. I don't know who has hands like that. I don't know if that person exists. That was the night Dmitri Voss had started watching the county hospital. Not the private ones with their marble lobbies and their surgeons who golfed. The county hospital, the one that took the city's violence raw at 3 in the morning. No appointment, no anesthesia consult, no time. The place where hands either shook or they didn't, and where the ones that didn't were forged in a fire the private hospitals never lit. He had found her in the second week, a woman with grief in the set of her shoulders, and God in her fingers working a double shift into a triple, bringing back a man the paramedics had already written off. He had watched her not flinch. He had watched her not celebrate. He had watched her wash her hands and go back out for the next one, and he had thought there. So he had begun to send her the wounded. It was, he would admit, only to himself, a monstrous thing to do. When his men were hurt, and in the war Kestrel kept feeding, they were hurt, often he had them driven past 3 closer hospitals to hers. He wanted to watch her, under the worst conditions his money could manufacture. Complications, blood loss, a man arriving nearly dead. He needed to know before he laid his own life open on her table, that there was no version of catastrophe that could make those hands shake. He told himself it was diligence. He told himself it was survival. He told himself a great many things, and every one of them was true. And none of them explained why he had started coming himself, night after night, to sit in the dark and watch a woman he had never spoken to push her hair off her forehead with the back of her wrist. The 8th man arrived on the worst night of the month, and this time the shooter had made a mistake, and the mistake was that he had missed. Not missed the target. Kestrel's men never missed the target. He had missed the timing. The man came in, still holding the gun, delirious with pain and blood loss, and when the trauma team swarmed him, he came up off the gurney, screaming and firing. 2 rounds into the ceiling, a third that took a security guard in the thigh. And Priya, who had been reaching for the man's chest, who was closer to him than anyone, found herself looking down the barrel of a shaking pistol, held by a dying man who no longer knew where he was. She did not run. She would think about this later, too. Every instinct that should have thrown her backward instead held her still, and she heard her own voice come out flat and low and absolutely calm. You're bleeding to death. I'm the only person in this room who can stop it. Give me the gun and let me save your life. The man looked at her. The gun did not lower. And then the doors to the trauma bay opened, and the temperature of the room changed. He came in the way weather comes in. Priya's first impression was not of a face, but of a stillness. Every other person in the room was moving, shouting, ducking, and this one man walked through the chaos as if it were a courtesy being extended to him. He was tall, dark-coated, unhurried. He did not look at the guns. He looked at her, once, a single flick of the eyes that took in the whole scene and filed it. And then he looked at the man on the gurney and said one word, in a language she didn't know, in a voice so quiet the room seemed to lean toward it to hear. The dying man dropped the gun, as if it had burned him. Later security footage would show that 4 other men had entered behind this one, and that the guns they carried had made every armed person in that room, including the 2 off-duty police officers, decide very suddenly to keep their hands where everyone could see them. But Priya didn't see any of that. Priya saw only that the barrel was no longer pointing at her, that her patient was crashing, and that a stranger in a beautiful coat was watching her, with an expression she had no name for, something between hunger and grief. "Get out of my trauma bay," she said to him, and turned back to her patient and began once again to save a life. He did not get out. He stood against the wall out of the way with a stillness that was somehow louder than everyone else's noise, and he watched her open a man's chest with her bare hands, and reach in and hold a heart until it remembered what it was for. When it was over, when the patient was stable and rolling toward the OR, and Priya was standing in a lake of another human being's blood with her chest heaving, she turned to tell the stranger again to leave. He was gone. Where he had stood there was only a smear on the polished floor, and on the counter beside the glove dispenser, a single object he had left behind, a scan. An X-ray, folded once of a chest she didn't recognize, with a small bright fleck of metal near the heart, and on the white margin, in handwriting like a blade, 4 words, "You are the one." Priya stared at it for a long time. Then she folded it into her pocket and told herself she would throw it away, and did not. He came to her the 3rd time, not with an army, but alone, and that frightened her more. She was on the roof. The county hospital had a helipad, and off to one side a strip of gravel and dead grass where the doctors who still smoked came to poison themselves under the stars, and where Priya came on the worst nights to stand at the railing and let the ocean wind take the smell of the trauma bay off her skin. She did not smoke. She came up here to remember she was a person. It was the one place she felt truly alone. She was not alone. He was standing at the far end of the roof, at the railing, looking out at the neon smear of the city, and he did not turn when the door closed behind her. For a moment, she considered going back down. For a moment, she considered screaming. Instead, she found herself walking toward him because she was so tired, and because he was the puzzle she had been refusing to solve, and because some reckless, exhausted part of her had decided she would rather know than be safe. "You're the one sending them," she said. It wasn't a question. "The men with the birds on their chests, you've been sending them to me." Yes, he didn't turn. Why? Now he turned. In the wash of the helipad lights, she saw his face fully for the first time. A hard, tired, beautiful face, older than she'd thought, with eyes that had seen the inside of the same fire hers had. "Because I needed to know if you were real," he said. "Surgeons lie about their hands the way soldiers lie about their nerve. Everyone thinks they don't shake until the moment they do. I could not afford to find out at the wrong time." Find out what? He didn't answer that. Instead, he said, "Do you know who I am?" "No." "Good," he said, and something moved behind his eyes that might in another man have been sorrow. "It's better if you don't. It's better, Dr. Anand, if, after tonight, you forget you ever saw my face, and you go back to your table and your city and your very small, very good life, and you let me disappear the way I'm good at disappearing." He said it like a man reading a sentence he'd written for himself and hated. "That would be the smart thing, for you. I came up here to tell you that." "But that's not what you're going to do," she said. The wind pulled at his coat. Somewhere below them an ambulance began to wail. "No," he admitted. "It isn't." He took the scan from his own pocket, a copy of the one he'd left her, and held it out. And in the helipad light, she saw it clearly now. The fragment, the heart, the small, bright, fatal geometry of it. "3 surgeons told me this will kill me," he said. "The best in the country told me the only thing that could save me is a pair of hands that don't shake with a chest open and no time on the clock. I have spent 6 weeks looking for those hands." He looked at her, and for one naked instant, the most feared man in Miami was simply a frightened human being, asking another human being not to let him die. "I found them. They're attached to a woman who just told me to get out of her trauma bay while a man was pointing a gun at her heart and who didn't blink." Priya looked at the scan. She looked at the man. Every ethical wall she had spent a career building told her to walk away. You do not operate on a stranger who stalks you. You do not cut open a man whose name inspires that kind of silence in a veteran nurse. You do not step 1 inch off the edge of the table into the war that has been feeding you its wounded. Every wall told her no. And underneath the walls, in the reckless, exhausted place where she kept the grief she never talked about, a quieter voice said, "You became a surgeon because you couldn't save the one person you needed to. Here is a person you can save. Here is a door you can put your hand against before it closes." "I don't even know your name," she said. "Dmitri," he said. And then because he had decided up here on the roof to give her one true thing before the lies became necessary again. "The people who fear me call me the ghost." She should have been afraid. She was afraid. But she had been holding fear in her hands her whole life, and she had learned the trick of it, which is that you do the thing anyway. "If I do this," she said, "I do it my way, my protocols, my people. And you tell me the truth about everything, or I stop cutting and let you die on the table. I've done it before to men I liked better than you." For the first time, the ghost smiled. It transformed his face the way lightning transforms a landscape, briefly, completely, and gone. "I believe you," he said. "That's why it has to be you." She should have known it was a trap, but the trap was not the one she was watching for. She was watching Dmitri. She had steeled herself for the danger of him, the men with guns, the silence he pulled through rooms, The way her own body betrayed her with a warmth she despised whenever he came too close. She catalogued all of it, the way she catalogued a patient's vitals, clinically, at arm's length. And she told herself that as long as she saw the danger clearly, she could not be hurt by it. She did not understand yet that the things that hurt us most are never the things we're staring at. They operated in a private surgical suite that had appeared fully equipped in a warehouse near the port, the kind of place his money could conjure overnight. She brought two people she trusted with her life, an anesthesiologist named Ben, who asked no questions, and a scrub nurse named Coralie, who had done tours in places worse than Miami. Dmitri's people stood along the walls, armed, silent, and she made them turn their backs to the field because she would not work with an audience watching her hands. And she got him. That was the thing. She reached the fragment where 3 better-credentialed men had refused to try, and she took it out, a fleck of steel so small it seemed impossible it could kill anyone. And she closed him up, and she stood there afterward, drenched and shaking, finally, now that it was safe to shake. And she watched the monitor draw the steady green mountains of a heart that had decided to keep going. She had put her hand against the door and held it open. He woke in the gray hour before dawn, and the first thing he did before he knew where he was, before he knew if he had lived, was find her face in the room and say her name. Not did it work, not am I alive. Her name, Priya. Like an answer he'd been carrying to a question he hadn't dared ask. She should have left then. The job was done. But she stayed, because you do not leave a post-op patient in a warehouse with armed men who don't know a hemorrhage from a hangnail. And because she admitted this to no one, least of all herself, she wanted to be there when he opened his eyes. She sat by his bed through the dangerous first day and the more dangerous first night. And somewhere in those hours, the thing she had been keeping at arm's length climbed over the wall. He talked because pain and morphine loosen even a ghost. He told her about Odessa, about the fire that had put the steel in his chest, about the brother who had died in it, and the promise he'd made over the body, a promise that had turned him into the thing he was, a promise he no longer remembered the point of. He told her he had not been touched with kindness by another human being in so long that her hand on his wrist, checking his pulse, had felt like the first warm thing in years. He said it plainly, without seduction, the way a dying man says true things, and it undid her more thoroughly than any charm could have. And she talked what she never did. She told him about the sister she had not been able to save, the reason she cut the grief she'd buried under 18-hour shifts for 11 years. She had never told anyone. She told him because he was a man who lived surrounded by death, and did not look away from it. And because in the gray warehouse light with the monitors beeping, and the armed men gone soft with sleep against the walls, she felt for the first time in 11 years that she was not alone inside her own history. He reached for her hand once and stopped his fingers an inch from hers, and she watched him decide not to, watched the discipline of it cost him. And she understood that this man who could order a life, ended with a single quiet word, was holding himself back from the smallest thing a touch, because he had decided that her consent was the one thing in the world he was not permitted to take. She was the one who closed the inch. The betrayal, when it came, did not come from him. It came from a man named Adrian Kestrel, and it had been coming for 18 months. Priya learned his name the way you learn the name of the disease that's already inside you, too late to have prevented it in time, only to name what was killing you. She learned it because 3 days after the surgery, when Dmitri was strong enough to be moved, the safe house was attacked, and in the chaos of it, the muzzle flashes strobing across a candlelit mansion, the black SUVs disgorging men into the rain, Dmitri putting his own body between her and the door with a stitched chest that should not have been standing. She saw one of the attackers hesitate, saw him lower his gun a fraction, when he recognized the man he'd been sent to kill was already up, already moving, already impossibly alive. And she understood in that half second that the attackers had expected to find the ghost flat on his back, weak, recovering. They knew he'd had surgery. They knew when. They knew where. Someone close to Dmitri had told them. It was Dmitri who put it together, later in the gray after, with a stillness worse than any rage. Kestrel was his underboss, his second, the man he'd trusted to run the war while he was healing, the man who had been feeding that war for 18 months. The shootings, the wounded men with the birds on their chests. Priya had thought the pattern was Dmitri sending her his soldiers to audition her hands. Half of that was true, but she had missed the deeper pattern, the one underneath. Someone had been manufacturing those casualties, starting the fights, putting Dmitri's men in front of bullets night after night, bleeding the family slowly because a slow war gave Kestrel cover to move his own pieces, and because the more the family bled, the more indispensable Kestrel made himself, and because this was the part that turned Priya's stomach. Kestrel had known about the fragment in Dmitri's chest for months, had been waiting for it to kill him, had engineered a war violent enough to keep Dmitri distracted while the steel crept toward his heart. And then Priya had done the unthinkable. She had saved him. She had reached into the ghost's chest and taken out the thing that was supposed to inherit Kestrel and Empire. And in doing so, she had made herself the most important obstacle in Adrian Kestrel's path. Dead men can't protect you, but Dmitri was not going to be a dead man now, which meant Kestrel needed a new plan. And the new plan was simple and old as blood. If you cannot kill the king, you take the thing the king loves, and you make him trade the crown for it. He's going to come for you, Dmitri told her, and it was the only time she ever heard his voice shake. Not for me, for you, because he knows. He stopped. He looked at her with those tired, terrible eyes, and he said the truth he had not said on the roof, had not said in the warehouse, had been holding behind his teeth like a live coal. Because he knows what you are to me. Before I knew it myself, he knew. That's how he's still alive. He sees the thing in a man that the man refuses to see, and he puts his knife there. And what am I to you? Priya said, because she was tired of walls, his and hers both. He crossed the room to her. He was pale and his stitches pulled, and he should not have been on his feet. He stopped an inch away, that inch again, that discipline. And this time he did not close it, and neither did she. And the not closing of it was louder than any kiss. "You're the door I put my hand against," he said, which made no sense to anyone but her, because she had told him about the door in the gray warehouse hours, and he had kept it the way he kept every true thing she gave him. "You're the reason I want the years I stole back. You are the one thing in my whole life I have decided I will not lose. And I have lost everything, Priya. Everyone. I let them go because I told myself I felt nothing. I can't tell myself that about you. I've tried. It's the only lie I've ever failed to believe." Kestrel took her from the hospital parking garage on a Tuesday in the rain, 3 men and a van, and he was almost gentle about it, which was the most frightening thing of all. He wanted her alive. That was clear immediately, and it was the only thing keeping her calm. A man who wants you alive can be reasoned with, or stalled, or outlasted. Adrian Kestrel was younger than she'd expected, lean and courteous, with a face that would have looked at home behind a bank desk. He apologized for the restraints. He offered her water, and then he explained, in the reasonable tone of a man discussing a merger, exactly how the next hours would go. He would call Dmitri Voss, and he would offer a trade, the woman for the family. Dmitri would sign over everything, the whole architecture of power he'd spent a decade building, and dissolve back into the ghost he'd once been. And in exchange, Kestrel would let the surgeon walk away untouched. It was, Kestrel said, a good deal. It was more mercy than the ghost had ever shown anyone. "He won't do it," Priya said, though she wasn't sure it was true, and the not being sure sat in her chest like a stone. Kestrel smiled. "He will. That's the tragedy of what you've done to him, doctor. You've made him a man who can lose something. Do you understand what a catastrophe that is for someone like him? For years, he was untouchable because he had nothing anyone could take. And then you reached into his chest." He said it almost admiringly. "You took out the metal, and you put in a weakness 1,000 times more fatal. You made him love you. I couldn't have killed him better myself." She thought about that for a long time, tied to a chair in a warehouse that smelled of salt and rust, listening to the rain. And somewhere in the long, wet hours, she stopped being afraid and started being angry. And the anger was clean and cold, and it steadied her hands the way it always had. Because Kestrel had made an error. The same error everyone made about Priya Anand. He had looked at her and seen a surgeon, a healer, a fixer, a set of gifted hands attached to a soft heart, a hostage, a thing to be traded. He had not looked closely enough to see the other thing she was, the thing the county ER had forged in her over 11 years of 3 a.m. catastrophes. A woman who did not panic when the blood came, who thought fastest exactly when everyone else's minds went white, who had held 100 lives on the tips of her fingers and learned the one truth that mattered, that the person who stays calm when the clock is running is the person who decides how it ends. When Kestrel finally made the call, he put it on speaker because he wanted her to hear the ghost surrender. He wanted her to hear the empire fall for her sake. It was she understood part of the pleasure of it for him. Dmitri's voice came through the phone flat and dead and calm. Let me hear her. Say something, doctor, Kestrel said pleasantly, and Priya, who had been watching everything for hours the way she watched a patient's vitals, the 2 guards, the 3rd man by the door, the position of the van, the single exit, the untidy way Kestrel kept his weapon holstered because he thought himself safe with the tied-up surgeon. Priya leaned toward the phone and did not say, "Save me." She said, "Dmitri, right lower quadrant, 2 on the field, 1 at the door. His stitches are the weak point." There was a silence on the line. Kestrel's pleasant expression flickered. "What does that?" "It's how surgeons talk," she said, and smiled at him, and it was not a soft smile at all. "You should have looked closer." What happened next happened fast, the way the worst things always do, and Priya would only be able to reassemble it afterward in fragments, the way she'd reassembled the pattern of the birds. Right lower quadrant, she'd told Dmitri where the men were positioned in the room, in the private grammar they'd built over 3 days of surgery and confession, mapping the warehouse onto a body so he'd know the field before he came through the door. His stitches are the weak point. She'd told him she was watching Kestrel, that she'd seen the man favor his left side, where an old wound sat. Information a surgeon gathers without trying, information worth more than a gun. And Dmitri Voss, who should have been in a bed with a stitched chest, who, by every medical fact Priya possessed, should not have been able to stand, came through the warehouse door, out of the rain, like the weather coming in. She had put her body low the instant the line went dead, chair and all the way you drop below the smoke. The 2 guards in the right lower quadrant turned toward the door, and that was the last mistake they made. There was noise, and there was light, and there was the specific silence that came with Dmitri, pulled through the room like a held breath. And then there was Adrian Kestrel, dragging her up by the arm with a pistol against her temple, backing toward the exit. His reasonable banker's face, finally, wonderfully, afraid. "I'll do it," Kestrel said. "You know I'll do it. Stop where you are, or I put her." "Left side," Priya said. She said it quietly, just for Dmitri, the last coordinate, the weak point, and she felt Kestrel's arm shift as the words confused him for a 1/4 of a second. And a 1/4 of a second in a trauma bay or a warehouse is the entire distance between living and dying. She threw her weight against his left side, into the old wound she'd catalogued without meaning to, and Kestrel folded exactly the way a body folds, when you know where it's weakest. And the gun came off her temple, and the silence that was Dmitri crossed the room. It was over in a moment. She did not watch the end of Adrian Kestrel. She had spent her life pulling men back from that particular edge, and she found she did not need to see one go over it. She was on the floor in the rust and the salt, and then she was not on the floor because Dmitri had her bloodied, his stitches torn open and bleeding through his shirt, his hands shaking now. Finally, the great, steady, terrible hands of the ghost, shaking as they cupped her face and moved over her arms and her shoulders, checking her for wounds the way she checked her patients, murmuring her name over and over, like the only word he had left. "I'm fine," she said. Dmitri, look at me. I'm fine. But you're not your chest. You've torn everything. You're bleeding." And the most feared man in Miami, kneeling on a filthy warehouse floor in the rain, with his enemy dead behind him and his blood soaking through his shirt, began impossibly to laugh. A rough, cracked, disbelieving sound, his forehead pressed to hers. "Then fix me," he said. "You keep doing that. You keep reaching into my chest and taking out the thing that's killing me." He pulled back just enough to look at her, and there was nothing of the ghost left in his face, only the man. "Fix me, Priya. And then don't leave. That's the whole of it. That's everything I have to say. I have killed for less than what you are to me, and I will never touch you unless you ask. And I am asking you, don't leave." She put her hand flat against his bleeding chest, over the torn stitches, over the healing hole, where the steel had been over the heart she had held in her own 2 hands, and taught to keep going. "Hold still," she said, which was how she said yes, which was how she'd always said the things that mattered most. "You're going to be fine." And this time, it was not a lie. They did not ride off into anything. That is not how it went, and Priya would not have believed it if it had. There was the long, ugly aftermath of a dead underboss, and a fractured family, and a war that had to be ended for real this time. Not with more bodies fed into a county ER, but with the slow, dangerous work of a man dismantling the very thing he'd built. Dmitri did it. It took months. He did not become a good man. Priya harbored no illusion of that, and would have distrusted him if he'd tried to sell it to her. But he became a man who was trying to become done, trying to reach the far shore of a life that had been nothing but blood. Because for the first time, there was something on the far shore worth swimming toward. And Priya went back to her table. That was the part that surprised everyone, including her. She did not let him carry her out of her life into some gilded penthouse where she'd exist as a beautiful, protected, useless thing. She'd told him on the roof that she'd do it her way, and her way included the county hospital, and the 3 a.m. catastrophes, and the neon bleeding through the ambulance bay doors, because she was a surgeon before she was anyone's beloved. And a man who couldn't understand that had no business loving her. He understood it. He was, she came to learn. A man who understood exactly one person completely, and it was her. So on the nights she worked, a black car sat across the street, with glass so dark it swallowed the neon, and she stopped telling him to leave, and eventually, she started walking out to it at the end of her shift, still in her scrubs, still smelling of the work, and finding him there in the dark, waiting. The most patient man in the world for exactly one thing. The last man with a bird tattooed over his heart came into her ER on an ordinary Tuesday, long after. And this time she was not too tired to see the pattern, because there was no pattern anymore. Just a man who'd been in a bar fight, ordinary as rain, and she stitched him and sent him home. And when she came out into the ambulance bay afterward and saw the black car, she stood for a moment under the red and blue wash, and let herself feel the whole strange shape of what her life had become. That she had once been a woman too exhausted to notice she was being watched, and had become a woman who walked unafraid toward the most dangerous man in the city, and put her hand against the door and held it open. He got out of the car when he saw her, which he always did because he had decided long ago that she would never have to come to him. He would always, always come the rest of the way. He stood in the rain in his beautiful coat, and he did not reach for her until she reached for him first. That old discipline, that inch he would never cross without her. And when she closed it, when she stepped into the circle of him, with the neon running down both their faces, he let out the breath he seemed to have been holding since Odessa. "Long night," he said against her hair. "They're all long nights," she said. "That's the job." "I know." His arms came around her, careful, always careful, of the woman with God in her hands, who had reached into his chest and taken out the thing that was killing him and put in something 1,000 times more fatal, and who had turned out to be the only weakness that ever made him stronger. "I'll wait for all of them." And he did.